Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at this really interesting article from the Financial Times about
Hmm.
something they're calling American Wolf Warrior diplomacy.
Oh, wow.
For years we've been hearing all this talk about, the shift.
But then around 2017, under Xi Jinping,
Yeah.
things took a bit of a turn.
Right. That's when we started hearing about Wolf Warrior diplomacy.
Exactly.
I remember it seemed like Chinese diplomats were suddenly everywhere,
Yeah.
pushing back hard on any criticism, using really strong language, even getting into public spats with officials from other countries.
Hmm.
It felt like such a departure from their previous, more cautious approach.
It was, and I think one of the unintended consequences of that new assertiveness was that it kind of backfired in some ways.
Really?
Yeah, instead of earning respect, it sparked anxieties.
Hmm.
A lot of countries started viewing China with suspicion,
Yeah.
wondering if that peaceful rise narrative was just a facade.
Right.
Ironically, it pushed some nations closer to the U.S., seeking a counterbalance to China's growing power.
So it's like China overplayed their hand a little bit.
You could say that.
Like they wanted to project strength, but just ended making everyone nervous.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And now this article is suggesting that the U.S. under Trump might be making the same mistake.
Well, the article points to Trump's close ties with Silicon Valley
Right.
and this shared sense of American exceptionalism, especially when it comes to technology.
Hmm.
It's almost like they believe the U.S. is playing by a different set of rules because of their tech dominance.
Yeah, the article actually uses this phrase, supreme self-confidence and a disregard for rules.
Wow.
It paints a picture of like a tech CEO who's used to disrupting industries, not a diplomat who's supposed to be building bridges.
Hmm.
And with that mindset, it's easy to see how clashes with other countries could become more frequent.
Exactly. And it's not just about individual clashes,
Right?
but the overall tone and message it sends.
Yeah.
The article makes a comparison to China's wolf warrior phase, arguing that it wasn't just isolated incidents,
Hmm.
but the cumulative effect of their actions and rhetoric that really shaped global perceptions.
Right.
If the U.S. follows a similar path, we could see a comparable pattern unfold.
Okay, so we've got China, which has already had its wolf warrior moment.
Right.
And now potentially the U.S. heading in the same direction.
Yeah.
Where does that leave everyone else?
Well, the article specifically mentions the EU,
Okay.
which has been at odds with U.S. tech giants for years.
Mm-hmm.
They've been trying to regulate big tech, address concerns about data privacy market dominance,
Right.
basically asserting their own digital sovereignty.
And this whole thing with Meta refusing to deploy its AI in the EU,
Yeah,
that seems like a major point of contention.
it is.
Could this kind of pushback from the U.S. actually accelerate the EU's drive for technological independence?
It's definitely a possibility.
Hmm.
We're already seeing the EU investing heavily in its own tech capabilities,
Yeah.
AI, cloud computing, you name it.
Right.
And this pressure from the U.S. could give those efforts even more momentum.
Yeah.
Think about it. If the EU feels like it can't rely on U.S. tech, it has even more incentive to build its own.
And it's not just the EU.
No, not at all.
The article also talks about other countries,
Mm-hmm.
Mexico, India, Brazil, feeling the heat.
Right.
It's like this America-first approach could alienate even friendly nations
Yeah.
if they feel pressured to constantly prioritize U.S. interests above their own.
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
It highlights how this wolf warrior style, whether it's coming from China or the U.S., can backfire by creating resentment and pushing countries away,
Even potential allies.
even potential allies, exactly.
So we're seeing this pattern emerge where powerful nations are resorting to aggression and unilateralism.
Yeah,
But hasn't the U.S. traditionally favored a more multilateral approach,
right.
working with allies and international organizations?
Mm-hmm.
What happened to that?
You're right. There has been this back and forth in U.S. foreign policy between multilateralism and unilateralism,
Oh.
depending on the administration.
Right.
But what's concerning is that each swing of the pendulum seems to erode a bit more of America's credibility as a reliable partner.
It's almost like this constant flip-flopping makes it hard for other countries to trust the U.S. One minute, they're all about cooperation. The next minute, it's my way or the highway.
Right.
It's got to make it tough to build lasting partnerships.
It definitely creates a sense of uncertainty and unpredictability.
Yeah.
And that's not a good foundation for stable international relations.
So what does this all mean for the future of global diplomacy?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
If this trend towards wolf warrior diplomacy continues,
Mm-hmm.
We could be looking at a world where international cooperation becomes increasingly difficult,
If not impossible.
if not
A
impossible.
world where everyone is just out for themselves.
Potentially.
That sounds pretty chaotic.
It's certainly a possibility and one that we need to seriously consider.
Yeah.
If the U.S., with its long history of global leadership,
Right.
embraces this more aggressive approach,
Mm.
it could have a ripple effect encouraging other nations to follow suit.
So instead of working together to address global challenges like climate change and pandemics,
Right.
we could end up in a world of constant bickering and competition.
It's a risk we can't ignore, and the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah.
We're facing so many complex challenges that require global cooperation to solve.
For sure.
If we all retreat into our own corners, focus solely on our own interests,
Right.
it's hard to see how we can effectively address these issues.
So what happens when the global perception of the U.S. shifts from a reliable partner to, well, bully? What are the long-term consequences of this potential shift in global power?
It's a sobering question and one that we need to grapple with.
Yeah.
Because if history teaches us anything, it's that unilateralism and arrogance rarely lead to positive outcomes on the world stage.
Okay.
In fact, the damage caused by this potential new era of American wolf warrior diplomacy could be even more lasting than the harm caused by China's approach.
Wow, that's a pretty stark warning.
It is.
But why would the U.S. embracing wolf warrior diplomacy be even more damaging than what we saw with China?
I think it comes down to expectations and the U.S.'s historical role.
Okay.
China's rise as a global power is relatively recent, so its assertive behavior might be seen by some as a predictable growing pain.
Right.
But the U.S. has long held a position of global leadership,
Yeah.
and its actions are held to a different standard.
Mm.
When the U.S. acts in a way that's perceived as aggressive or self-serving,
Right.
it has a much greater impact on the international system.
It's like the difference between a new kid on the block pushing their way in
Yeah.
and the established leader throwing their weight around.
Precisely.
Right.
And that difference in perception can have a significant impact on how other countries respond.
Yeah.
When the U.S. acts in a way that's seen as violating norms or disregarding international agreements, it sets a dangerous precedent.
Right.
It emboldens other countries to do the same, and it undermines the very institutions and principles that are meant to govern international relations.
So we're potentially looking at a future where the rules-based international order, which has been in place for decades, starts to unravel.
That's certainly a risk we need to be aware of, and the consequences of such an unraveling could be quite severe.
Like what?
Well, we could see an increase in conflict, a decline in global trade,
Right.
and a world that is much less stable and predictable.
That's a pretty bleak picture.
It is.
But is there anything that can be done to prevent this from happening?
Yeah.
Are there any forces pushing back against this trend towards a more assertive and potentially destabilizing approach to foreign policy?
There are always countervailing forces at play.
Okay.
For example, within the U.S., there are many voices advocating for a more cooperative and multilateral approach to foreign policy. They argue that the U.S. can best advance its interests by working with allies, upholding international norms, and contributing to global solutions.
So it's not a foregone conclusion that the U.S. will fully embrace this wolf warrior approach.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
The future direction of U.S. foreign policy is still very much up for debate.
Yeah.
And there are many factors that will shape its trajectory in the years to come. But this article raises some important questions and challenges us to think critically about the potential consequences of different approaches.
And for those of you listening around the world, this isn't just a U.S. issue.
It's not.
The choices that the U.S. makes have global repercussions.
Yeah.
And they impact all of us.
Absolutely.
So it's more important than ever to be informed, engaged, and to make your voices heard.
You're absolutely right. What happens on the world stage affects us all,
Yeah.
whether it's in terms of our economic well-being, our security, or our ability to address shared challenges like climate change.
It's a reminder that global affairs are not some abstract concept, but something that touches every aspect of our lives.
It really is.
And as we've seen from this deep dive so far, understanding these complex dynamics is essential if we want to navigate the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century.
And that's why conversations like this are so important.
Yeah, I agree.
They help us to unpack complex issues, to explore different perspectives, and to make sense of the rapidly changing world around us.
Speaking of unpacking, we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
But there's one more point I want to pick up on from the article.
Okay.
It talks about how rising middle powers are no longer content to be pawns in a U.S.-China competition.
That's a crucial observation.
Yeah.
We're seeing the emergence of a multipolar world where power is becoming more diffuse, and countries like India, Brazil, Turkey, and others are asserting their own interests and autonomy on the global stage.
And how does that factor into this whole wolf warrior dynamic?
That's a good question.
Does it make it more likely that we'll see other countries adopting this more assertive approach?
It's certainly possible.
Okay.
As these middle powers gain influence, they may be tempted to emulate the tactics of the larger powers,
Right.
particularly if they perceive that aggression is being rewarded.
So we could end up in a world where wolf warrior diplomacy becomes the norm,
Yeah,
with countries increasingly resorting to threats and intimidation to get what they want.
that's a concerning prospect and one that we need to guard against. It's essential to remember that diplomacy is about finding common ground, building relationships, and resolving differences peacefully.
It seems like we're at a crossroads,
We are.
and the choices we make in the coming years will determine whether we move towards a more cooperative or a more conflict-ridden world.
And that's why it's so important to have these conversations, to engage with these issues.
For sure.
And to demand that our leaders pursue policies that promote peace, cooperation, and global well-being.
Well, we've definitely covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive into American wolf warrior diplomacy.
We have.
It's a complex issue with far-reaching implications, and we're just getting started.
Right.
But before we jump into the next part, a quick reminder to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends and fellow global affairs enthusiasts.
Yes, please do.
We'll be back in just a moment to continue our exploration of this fascinating and, frankly, pretty concerning trend in global politics.
You know, it's interesting. This whole idea of wolf warrior diplomacy really challenges our image of diplomacy as this quiet, behind-the-scenes kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely more in your face. It's like diplomacy has gone viral, playing out on social media and in the headlines.
Exactly. And that's part of what makes it so potent, but also potentially dangerous, because it can escalate tensions so quickly and make it harder to find that common ground. It's like trying to have a nuanced conversation when everyone's shouting.
Yeah, in a room full of people shouting at each other.
Right.
Okay, but let's play devil's advocate for a second.
Okay.
Isn't there some level of assertiveness that's necessary in today's world?
Sure.
I mean, countries have to stand up for their own interests, especially when they're dealing with rivals like China.
That's a fair point. It is a delicate balance.
Yeah.
There's a difference between advocating for your interests forcefully and resorting to aggression or bullying tactics.
Right.
And that's where this wolf warrior approach gets tricky. It can easily cross that line and end up being counterproductive.
So how do you strike that balance then? How do you stand up for your values and interests without alienating potential allies or, escalating tensions?
Well, it requires a more sophisticated approach to diplomacy. It's not just about projecting strength, but also about building trust, finding common ground, and understanding the perspectives of others.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that in a globalized world, our fates are all intertwined.
Yeah.
And cooperation is often the most effective path to achieving our goals.
But with all this talk of America first and China's assertive rise, it feels like that kind of cooperation is becoming increasingly rare. Like everyone is retreating to their own camps, just focused on winning, even if it means others lose.
There's definitely a risk of that happening, but I think it's important to remember that this is not just about governments and leaders.
Right.
It's also about individuals, businesses, and civil society organizations.
Yeah.
There are countless examples of people from different countries working together to address shared challenges, whether it's in the realm of science, technology, culture, or humanitarian aid.
So you're saying that even if governments are at odds, there's still hope for cooperation at other levels?
Absolutely. In fact, these cross-border collaborations are often essential for driving progress and finding solutions to complex global issues. They can also help to build bridges and foster understanding, even when political relations are strained.
That's encouraging to hear, because I think a lot of people, myself included, feel pretty overwhelmed by all this talk of global power struggles and geopolitical maneuvering.
Yeah.
It can feel like we're just pawns in a game we don't understand and can't control.
I understand that feeling. It's easy to feel powerless when confronted with these huge, complex issues.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that we all have a role to play, even if it's just staying informed, engaging in dialogue, and supporting organizations that are working to promote peace and cooperation.
So instead of just doom scrolling through news headlines about the latest diplomatic spat, we should be actively seeking out information, connecting with people from different cultures, and advocating for policies that promote a more cooperative and peaceful world.
Exactly. And that's especially important in a world where information is so readily available, but also easily manipulated. We need to be critical thinkers, question our assumptions, and seek out diverse perspectives.
Speaking of diverse perspectives, you mentioned earlier that rising middle powers are no longer content to be pawns in a U.S.-China competition. What does that mean for the future of global power dynamics? Are we moving towards a world where power is more evenly distributed?
That's a complex question, and I don't think there's a simple answer. But what we're seeing is that countries like India, Brazil, Turkey, and others are increasingly asserting their own interests and seeking to play a more active role on the global stage.
And that's happening in part because of the changing nature of power itself. I mean, it's not just about military might anymore. It's also about economic influence, technological innovation, and even cultural soft power.
Precisely. The landscape of power is becoming more fluid and multifaceted, and that creates both opportunities and challenges for countries of all sizes. It means that smaller nations can potentially wield more influence than they could in the past. But it also requires them to be more strategic and nimble in their approach.
So instead of this bipolar world where the U.S. and China are the only players that matter, we're moving towards a more multipolar system where there are multiple centers of power.
That seems to be the direction things are heading, at least in the long term. But this transition is unlikely to be smooth or linear.
Right.
It will likely involve periods of instability, competition, and even conflict as countries adjust to this new reality and try to assert their place in the world.
So it's not necessarily a good thing that power is becoming more diffuse.
It's not inherently good or bad. It's more about how countries choose to wield that power and whether they prioritize cooperation or competition. A multipolar world could be a more balanced and peaceful world if countries work together to address shared challenges. But it could also be a more chaotic and dangerous world if countries prioritize their own narrow interests at the expense of the global good.
So it all comes back to choices, doesn't it?
It does.
The choices that leaders make, the choices that citizens make, the choices that businesses make, they all contribute to shaping the kind of world we want to live in.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations, to engage with these issues, and to demand that our leaders pursue policies that promote peace, cooperation, and global well-being. Because ultimately, the future is not predetermined. It's shaped by the actions we take today.
Okay, we've talked about the rise of wolf warrior diplomacy, the potential for a multipolar world, and the choices that we all face. But what does this all mean for our listeners? What's the takeaway for those tuning in from around the world?
I think the key message is that we are living in a time of profound change on the world stage. The old rules and assumptions are being challenged, and the future is far from certain. But that uncertainty also presents us with an opportunity to shape the world we want to live in.
It's a reminder that we're not just passive observers of global events, but active participants who can make a difference.
Exactly, whether it's through our choices as consumers, our engagement in political processes, or simply our willingness to stay informed and have these conversations, we can all contribute to a more peaceful, just, and sustainable world.
That's a message I can get behind.
Yeah.
So to our listeners out there, don't underestimate your power to make a difference. Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep those conversations going.
And never stop questioning, challenging, and seeking to understand the complex forces that shape our world.
Well, we've explored a lot of fascinating and at times unsettling terrain in this second part of our deep dive.
We have.
We've talked about the delicate balance between assertiveness and aggression in diplomacy, the potential for a multipolar world, and the choices that we all face in navigating this complex global landscape.
Right.
But there's still so much to unpack. We'll be back in just a moment for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll delve into some potential scenarios for the future of global diplomacy and explore what it all means for the pursuit of peace and cooperation in a world that seems increasingly divided. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into American wolf warrior diplomacy. We've covered a lot of ground, from China's shift to a more assertive foreign policy to the potential for the U.S. to follow a similar path. And we've talked about how rising middle powers are shaking things up, creating a more multipolar world. But now let's look ahead. What are some possible scenarios for the future of global diplomacy?
Well, one scenario is that this trend towards wolf warrior diplomacy continues to escalate. We could see more countries adopting this aggressive confrontational style, leading to a world where international relations are defined by constant bickering, mistrust, and a zero-sum competition. Imagine a world where every negotiation feels like a high-stakes poker game, with countries constantly bluffing, threatening, and trying to outmaneuver each other. That's not exactly a recipe for global stability.
That sounds pretty bleak, but is there any chance that things could go in a different direction? Could we see a resurgence of cooperation and a move away from this wolf warrior mentality?
It's definitely possible. Another scenario is that countries start to realize that this aggressive approach is ultimately counterproductive. They might recognize that in a world facing complex challenges like climate change, pandemics, and economic instability, cooperation is not just a nice to have, it's a necessity.
So instead of trying to go it alone, countries might start to see the value in working together, pooling resources and sharing knowledge to find solutions to these shared problems.
Exactly. It's like the old saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. The challenges we face today are too big and too complex for any one country to solve on its own.
But wouldn't that require a pretty significant shift in mindset? I mean, right now it feels like a lot of countries are more focused on competing than cooperating.
It would definitely require a shift. It would mean moving away from this zero-sum mentality where one country's gain is automatically seen as another country's loss. It would mean recognizing that cooperation can actually benefit everyone involved.
But how do you get countries to buy into that, especially when there's so much mistrust and competition already baked into the system?
Well, it starts with building trust,
Mhm.
and that's not easy. It requires open communication, transparency, and a willingness to compromise. It also requires finding areas of common ground, even when there are significant disagreements on other issues.
So maybe instead of focusing on all the things that divide us, we should be looking for opportunities to work together on issues where our interests align.
Exactly. For example, climate change is a global problem that affects every country on the planet. Whether you're a wealthy nation or a developing country, you're going to feel the impacts of a warming climate that creates a shared incentive to work together to find solutions.
So even in a world that's increasingly polarized, there are still areas where cooperation is not just possible, but essential.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to highlight those areas to showcase the successes of international cooperation and to remind people that we're not doomed to a future of endless conflict.
That's a message I think we all need to hear
Yeah.
because it's easy to get caught up in the doom and gloom of the news cycle and feel like the world is falling apart. But if we look closely, there are also signs of hope, examples of countries coming together to solve problems and individuals working across borders to make a positive difference.
And that's where our listeners come in. Remember, you're not just passive observers of global events. You have a voice and you have agency. You can choose to support organizations working to promote peace and cooperation. You can engage in dialogue with people from different cultures, and you can advocate for policies that reflect your values.
So it's not just about what our leaders do, it's also about what we do as individuals.
Exactly. Every action, no matter how small, contributes to shaping the kind of world we want to live in.
Well, this deep dive has certainly given me a lot to think about, and I hope it's done the same for our listeners. We've explored some complex and challenging issues, but we've also uncovered some reasons for optimism. The future of global diplomacy is far from certain, but it's ultimately up to us to decide what kind of world we want to create.
And remember, staying informed is crucial. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep engaging with these issues. The more we understand about the forces shaping our world, the better equipped we'll be to navigate the challenges and seize the opportunities that lie ahead.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into American wharf warrior diplomacy. We hope you found it insightful, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit inspiring. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. And until next time, stay curious and stay engaged. The world needs your voice.